What's up, boys? This is Negative, and this is a box style controller equipped with the standard Sanwa Denshi buttons. However, there's a lot of different buttons that you can put in these things. You can throw Seimitsus in here. You can even get some gamer fingers, right? Those ones, they've got a different aesthetic style to them. Some may not like it, but they're typically a little more expensive and harder to get your hands on, so most people aren't really going that route. Though they do have linear keyboard switches in them, I think they by default come with speed silvers. However, the new kit on the block and the one that most people go for these days is the 20MX kit from the Box team. So the 20MX kit, it comes equipped with Gatoron clears, and it allows you to insert them into the standard Sanwa Denshi button housing. So what makes the linear so great? Well, here's your standard Sanwa switch, right? And essentially, this plunger sits right on top, and when you press down on the plunger, it depresses the switch. Very simple. Whole thing basically sits inside the button housing. Now, the thing about the Sanwa buttons is that at different points in your depressing of the button, it requires a different amount of force to keep going. So essentially, like if you took a spring, for example, and you were trying to compress it, and you compressed it a certain amount, it's going to take more force to keep going. And it's not quite that extreme, but what it ends up doing is it kind of makes it feel a little less crisp and clean than using a high-end linear keyboard switch. And so a lot of people are going that route. I switched myself through a 20MX kit in here, and I'd love to say that I was perfectly satisfied because I really do love the feeling of the linear switches, and it is a great product. The problem is that the actuation depth is extreme in in a bad way. So let's just talk about that for a moment. Here is my start button. My start button right now is a standard Sanwa button with a Sanwa switch inside of it. Look at the ring around the button and how low the surface of the button is to this ring, right? I don't have to press this very far in order for it to activate, okay? Now, look how high all my other buttons sit compared to this ring. They sit a lot higher. And so what ends up happening is, for example, look how far I have to depress, let's say, my up button before it actually jumps. Let's try that one more time. So it still hasn't jumped there. That's too much, right? Because I can depress the button all the way to here, and it's like, nah, bro, you haven't pressed anything yet. I'm not doing shit. And so that's a problem. Because if you, let's say you tap jump with X and you want to slide off the button for your short hops, maybe to do like a wave dash, or maybe you wanted to short hop and do like an aerial with the C stick, now you did an F smash on the ground, right? So that's pretty bad. It's something that you want to avoid, and the question is, how can we go about mitigating this? How can we fix this problem? Because other than that, these buttons are perfect. So the question is, what can we do to decrease the actuation distance, thus increasing the responsiveness and sensitivity of our buttons? Well, one thing that we can try is to cut a little circle out of some plastic and insert it into the bottom of our button housing. That way, when we press the button down, then it actuates just a tiny bit faster. It turns out that was a bad way to go, because if you pressed really hard on the edges of the plunger, you could feel it grinding on the edges of this plastic disc. And the plastic disc as well, it still didn't feel 100% completely smooth like the linear switch normally did, so I didn't like this method. But it turns out there was a better method. These are little plastic caps that sit on the top of your linear switches. And these little plastic caps, normally the bottom of the plunger has this little column in the middle, and that's what presses down on the switch, right? However, the linear switches are too short. So you can press down on this, but it's not going deep enough to fully depress the switch, and so your button never actuates. So they put these little caps on there. They snap on top of your linear switch to make it a little taller, and now it's, the perfect height to press the button. However, it's actually not the perfect height. It's a little short. The fact that it's not tall enough means that we have to press this down farther to get that button to actuate. If they make the inside portion where this, you see it's kind of cut out, that little cutaway in the middle, if it goes down farther, then the button will be slightly pressed without you actually even pressing it yet. And so you essentially don't have to press it as far in order to actuate it. Now, if you make it too thick, the button will be permanently actuated, so you don't want to do that. Here's what we do. We take a piece of plastic, like so. I cut this, just a little sliver off of a mat that I got, a cutting board for $1 from Dollar Tree, and we trim it and snip it to a very, very narrow length. And we take that and we place it inside of our cap. We can get it to focus, maybe not, whatever. So we get it in there, and what it's going to do is allow it to just have that little extra bit of thickness, right? So our button is partially depressed from the get-go. If we put one in there, it feels almost perfectly like a Sanwa as far as how far you would normally have to press it to get it to actuate, except you still have the full perfect smoothness of the linear switch. If we put two in there, now it's a little bit more hairline. It's not quite hairline, but it's very sensitive. So here is the comparison. Let's go back to my B and see how far I have to press it now to get a B button. Well, if I lightly tap on the surface, rest my finger against it, I'm not actuating the B button. So it's not going to just immediately, just from resting my hand on it, actuate, but it's still very responsive. Let's see how far we have to go. So it actuates at here. That's great. That's about perfect for me. Maybe that's just a tiny bit too much for some folks. Then you'll want to just use one instead of two. But this is the responsiveness that I want. So it feels perfect. And the one other thing that it does is it does change the auditory acoustics. So here is what they sound like if you have a linear switch in a Sanwa housing when they bottom out, because it's shorter, you end up hitting plastic against plastic for the plunger against the housing, and you get kind of like a high-pitched tone with your button slaps, right? There's like a high end on this. Whereas once we have done this, when they bottom out, it's not completely plastic against plastic, so now it has a more muffled sound. It sounds more like a linear switch would, which actually sounds very nice. So it's so I prefer that. And yeah, I mean, it's obviously a pain in the ass to cut a bunch of little slivers and stuff them in these bad boys, but turns out it's actually pretty easy, right? You cut a strip of a certain length, you just snip off a bunch of them, grab the ones that look like they're roughly the right size. If it turns out they're slightly too long, you snip it again, stuff it in there. Use a tool like a very tiny micro flathead screwdriver that you can use to kind of like turn it over and make sure it's laying flat, because you don't want to cut it at a certain width and then have it sitting with the width in the vertical, because then it's going to have varying heights. You always want it to be the same height vertically, so that if you stack two, it's always the same amount of distance that you've decreased or increased the sensitivity. So basically, all your buttons will have a uniform feel if you do it this way, versus if it's like varying here, then your buttons are not going to feel uniform. So just make sure that you're aware of that. And that's all I got. Hopefully this helps some of you 20MX users or people that were considering picking it up. And yeah, catch you guys in the next one. Peace.